All right, so let's get started. Good morning, everyone from Australia. My name is Naya Liu. I'm the director of the Center for Environmental Law here at Macquarie University. Before kicking off this session, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Macquarie University land, the Watamagan clan of the Daru Nation, and whose culture and customs nurture and will continue to nurture on this land. And I sincerely pay my respect to the elders past, present, and future. And today, our panel is going to discuss the law, responsibility, and the biodiversity-climate-society nexus, which is very exciting kind of a connection between biodiversity and climate. We will have 5 papers, so it's a large panel. So each presenter will give a 15 minutes presentation, and then at the end of the all the 5 presentations, during their presentations, attendees and panelists are welcome to write your question in either the Q&A function or in the chat box, and we will read out at the end, and then the panelists can discuss and answer. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of today, Professor Jen MacDonald, on behalf of Karen Brand, Jeff McGee, and Philippa McCormack. Jen is a professor of environmental and climate law at the University of Tasmania. As part of the Australian Forum for Climate Intervention Governance, her current research examines the role of law in facilitating the development of technologies aimed at mitigating and adapting to the impacts of climate change and safeguarding against the risks that such technologies present. So Jen's paper is about taking the law towards net zero, the regulation of negative emission technologies in Australia. Jen, please.
Thank you so much, Nenge, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining this session. I'm joining you from Nipaluna Lutruwita, and I pay my respects to the Moanina people and their elders past, present, and emerging. This presentation's based on an article that's currently under review that comes from some work that the group of us did back in 2019, and it's taken this long to move it to manuscript stage. And I suppose last year events somewhat overtook us in that I think it's fair to say that 2021 and the events around the Glasgow COP really saw negative emissions and carbon dioxide removal discourse really assume a far more prominent role in international climate policy, and I think lay the stage for a stronger role for those things in Australian climate policy as well. You can see that I've adjusted the title of this presentation ever so slightly, because actually what negative emissions is about is really going beyond net zero, but actually towards the end of the century, actually starting to draw down atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. So we actually move towards negative emissions or a climate restoration program. And I suppose the starting point for understanding the impetus for CDR is of course the Paris Agreement's goals of ideally 1.5 degrees of maximum warming, but in any case a 2-degree maximum above pre-industrial levels. And the concern is that carbon dioxide removal is going to need to play a role even on the less onerous goal of a 2-degree increase in warming. The amount of carbon dioxide removal we're going to need is going to depend on the level of emissions, the level of emissions that we achieve in the near term, but certainly all of the pathways that have been modelled for achieving 1.5 or 2 degrees contemplate some use of carbon dioxide removal over the 21st century. So you can see this is an image from the 2021 emissions gap report, which UNEP produces every year. And it just shows it in a really nice visual way that from 2030 onwards, some form of carbon dioxide removal is going to be needed to complement emissions reductions, even to achieve what this one is representing, which is a maximum increase of 2 degrees of warming. And you can see that it's talking about negative emissions starting from 2030 to achieve net zero CO2 emissions by 2030, net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2070, and then net negative beyond that time. And the amount of negative emissions required is going to go up as we go along. The numbers are really worth taking into account here. So at the moment, on average, current levels of total CO2 emitted annually are in the region of about 40 gigatons of CO2. And the estimates are that to reach and maintain a maximum of 2 degrees of warming, we need to be thinking about 5 to about 20 gigatons of carbon dioxide removal every year. So it's somewhere around half of our current annual emissions that will need to be removed by the end of the century every year. So what we're talking about here is a really massive upscaling of the deployment of these kinds of technologies. We're using a really blanket term here with negative emissions technologies or carbon dioxide removal technologies. It refers to a really wide range of proposals, all of which in some way draw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it either in ocean or land-based sinks. Some of the key proposals that you can see on this slide include bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, blue carbon enhancement, direct air capture, so the artificial trees concept, and techniques like enhanced mineral weathering or ocean alkalinization. They're negative emissions because they seek to actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it long-term, if not permanently, thereby delivering this net reduction. And in that respect, it's important to distinguish them from activities that aim to remove greenhouse gases at source and reduce new emissions. So carbon capture and storage, I think, is the one that's most frequently confused here. Carbon capture and storage is something that can be used as part of current energy generation. And in that respect, it reduces current emissions, but it can also be deployed in conjunction with other negative emissions capture techniques in order to serve a negative emissions function. At the moment, Australia has no formal policy on nets at all. It doesn't have a policy on climate change at all, so that's probably not surprising. But I think, what we're suggesting is that nets will play a really critical part in Australia's future climate policy for a few reasons. The first and the most obvious is that our very poor progress on emissions reduction means that we're going to have to do a lot to supplement in order to achieve mitigation targets. The second is that even if we were to reduce future emissions to close to zero, we're going to have to draw down from the atmosphere in order to undertake that climate repair task. Australia has got unique geographical and natural features that make it really favourable to nets activities. We've got this vast ocean estate, and we've also got a very large land mass, both of which provide the basis for some of these at-scale emissions, negative emissions technologies. So Australia's got some opportunities that it can exploit here. But that's not to underplay the technical, the economic, the environmental and the social barriers and the risks to developing and upscaling, either on land or in the oceans. I think perhaps most importantly, there's this concern that supporting the upscaling of nets will in some way operate as a mitigation deterrent and provide that moral hazard. And we need to design policy and laws that avoid that kind of moral hazard impact. There are also, though, real concerns about the feasibility of just the sheer scale of negative emissions deployment that's required, and the environmental impacts that will come from choosing some of those technologies. So we think that we need to have a robust legal framework in place from the outset to build public confidence in nets, to be confident that it isn't going to be a displacement of emissions reduction ambition, and that needs to form part of a wider climate policy so that we can expand nets, we can do the R&D now, work out which candidate technologies offer the most potential for the Australian context, so that when deployment is actually really needed, we're in a position, we've resolved some of those environmental risks, the social opposition, the feasibility constraints, and we're then in a position to deploy. So we were interested in this paper to look at what the current landscape was. And one of the difficulties here is that there isn't a single, law that applies to all of these technologies. They're so diverse that we found that it was useful to understand or think about what laws actually applied by considering along one axis, if you like, the method of removing carbon dioxide, whether it was biological or technological or engineered. And then on the other axis, the method of actual storage, because there are different types of technology that you can see there that fall into each one of those quadrants, and they raise different legal issues, they raise different technological and environmental issues. So for some nets, afforestation and reforestation, both the removal and the storage techniques are one and the same. But for others, there's a really big difference between how you remove and how you store the carbon. One involves a natural source such as growing the trees, but then the storage involves capturing the carbon from burning those trees through bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and sequestering it underground. And that sequestration process involves very different considerations from the tensions surrounding the growing of the biomass in the first place. So that's an example of the kinds of disparate considerations that need to be given to whether our legal framework is satisfactory at the moment, whether it can meet the needs of these emerging technologies or society's needs for regulating these emerging technologies. And I don't propose to go into the technologies in detail. What I was trying to present to you here is sort of more of a conceptual framework about how we need to think about the law reform agenda more broadly. And so for each one of those types of technology, we see that there's a need to both incentivize research, development and deployment of appropriate candidate technologies, as well as managing the social and environmental risks and establishing liability frameworks, so the safeguards. So on the one hand, there's the enabling or the facilitation framework, and then on the other hand, there's the restraining or the safeguards kind of framework. And the facilitation framework, I think it's fair to say, is I think quite firmly in the climate law space. That's where we want a price on carbon. We need to have better frameworks around the balance between emissions reductions and other kinds of incentives for negative emissions. But when it comes to the risks, then you really do need to get to a technology specific inquiry, because those risks and how we deal with them in the law will be spread across land use planning for whether we grow trees rather than conserve biodiversity, environmental management in terms of pollution control, in some cases coastal management issues or ocean management issues, and in others there will be really significant workplace health and safety risks as well associated with applying biochar, for example, the pyrolyzed biochar, or the crushed olivine rock that's associated with enhanced weathering. So We do have the basis for all of these kinds of responses. The Climate Solutions Fund arguably would provide a framework, and it currently recognises emissions reductions from 2 land-based nets activities, afforestation and reforestation and soil carbon sequestration. But we need a lot more work there, and it will require tailoring to each one of these specific technologies as we work out which ones are the most appropriate and feasible in Australia. In terms of the safeguards, though, that's going to require quite a lot of iterations to work out what laws in what jurisdictions need specific attention. And in some cases, what we will need is a much more strategic cross-jurisdictional approach when we're talking about massive planting of biomass, for example, or the construction of pipelines across jurisdictions so that CO2 can get pumped to the appropriate sequestration location. So just to finish off in terms of what the broad law reform agenda might look like, there are some really clear reform priorities for improving incentives as well as for regulation. We have to start internationally, and I think that there's still some work to be done at the international level to clarify how nets should be counted in nationally determined contributions in order to avoid mitigation deterrence. And there's discussion in the literature already about the need to develop separate targets in NDCs for both emissions reduction and negative emissions. And similarly, I think we need to work then at the domestic level to put in place a much better incentives framework for making it worthwhile to conduct the R&D on some of these emerging emissions, negative emissions technologies. So by far the most important thing is the need for a coherent national policy, and establishing better incentives, but we also need stronger accounting and monitoring frameworks. And then at the safeguards level, we're going to need to look very carefully about how we deal with land use conflicts. We need much better harmonisation of our carbon capture and storage frameworks across the jurisdictions because they're really very disparate at the moment. And I'll just leave you with a final question because I can see that time's out. And that is the question of whether or not it's appropriate to quarantine or give some sort of preferential legal treatment to R&D activities. At the moment, there's a proposal to undertake some blue carbon kelp farming in the Bass Strait and to essentially exempt it from existing legal requirements. And I think that there is a case for small scale experiments enjoying some level of reduced legal oversight so that we can actually get the ball rolling on a greater upscaling of the R&D effort with a view to working out what these candidate technologies can offer us in the future. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jen. I'll just quickly move to our next paper. Our next paper is going to talk about from climate risk governance to corporate climate responsibility, the role of private climate regulation by Anita Foster and Michael Spencer. I'm not sure if I have Michael's bio, but Anita is a senior lecturer at Monash University based in the Department of Business Law and Taxation. At the Monash Business School, Anita researches in environmental and climate change law and regulation, with much of her recent work focusing on the roles and responsibilities of the private sector in addressing climate change. So yeah, I'll just leave you here and for the next 15 minutes.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Ningyi, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of Frontiers once again. My co-author on this paper is Dr. Michael Spencer, who's an expert in private environmental governance and has just completed his PhD. By way of introduction, since he didn't have the bio handy. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm presenting from the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung people and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Michael's running our slide, so if you could pop to the first slide, please. Okay, so over the last few years, and particularly in the lead up to the Conference of the Parties under the UNFCCC in Glasgow last year, headlines like this have become quite common. Big companies committing to net zero emissions reduction targets. So they're pretty exciting headlines. If the private sector just gets on with the job of reducing emissions in the real world, maybe it doesn't matter that nation states like Australia are dragging their heels. The research that we're presenting today engages with this phenomena of corporate net zero targets from an Australian perspective. It seeks to understand what's driving Australian companies to make these types of commitments to net zero, and whether they're likely to lead to meaningful, timely, adequate, verifiable contributions to reducing emissions in the real world, or whether, as the headline on the far right suggests, it's all just another big PR project. So just a little context before we get started. The 2015 Paris Agreement, of course, is international law, doesn't create direct legal obligations for private entities like companies. However, the temperature goals and the net zero goal that's articulated and agreed to by nation states through the agreement does provide this clear signal for the private sector of the direction of travel, the evolving regulatory and market context for business. Now, in Australia, we can't boast to having strong substantive climate law and policy in place to implement our obligations under the Paris Agreement, even with the recent announcement in the lead up to COP26 of a net zero goal at the national level. Our more near-term targets are not well aligned to the Paris Agreement goals, and our regulation of climate damaging activities through substantive measures that are available, such as carbon tax, such as emissions trading, such as emissions standards, such as project approvals, is weak. So in this context, there's been a lot of interest in exploring whether another body of law, corporate law and prudential regulation can partially fill some of these regulatory gaps. And it's now well recognised that climate change poses material financial risks to private entities such as companies, and that there are legal obligations which derive from corporate law for companies and their directors to disclose and manage these risks. But if we're thinking about using law to define the corporate responsibilities, in relation to climate change, then these regimes have quite significant limits. They focus on the risks that climate change poses to business, to private actors, to the financial system. They're not about the risks that business and investment decisions pose to the climate. They're also heavily reliant on process-based informational regulation. They're about raising awareness about risks, ensuring transparent sharing of risk information in order to ensure that risks are properly considered and priced in decision-making. So they're climate neutral regimes. There's no direction to manage risks in particular ways, for example, by reducing emissions at a magnitude and along a timeline that works in concert with what we're trying to achieve under the Paris Agreement. Next slide. So I guess alongside the corporate law and prudential regulatory frameworks that create obligations for companies to disclose and manage climate-related financial risks, there's a fast developing body of private climate regulation that's emerging to support, to guide, but also to pressure companies on their approach to climate risk management. So these are initiatives which involve non-state, private actors, companies, investors, industry bodies, civil society, in the development of best practice standards for risk disclosure and management, engaging in activities to drive the uptake of those standards, such as investor engagement activities, voting on shareholder resolutions, and also activities seeking to enforce those best practice standards, such as through strategic litigation. And what is quite notable about this body of private regulatory activity is it's really a central organising theme of aligning to net zero, aligning to the Paris Agreement is emerging. And what we're interested in with this research is exploring how this private climate regulation builds on and interacts with corporate law obligations, whether it's helping to develop more and embed more substantive corporate climate responsibilities. Will it actually drive Paris-aligned emissions reductions in the real world, but also perhaps might it help erode political roadblocks for the introduction of stronger law and policy on climate change by government actors. So just to quickly illustrate what we're talking about, a few examples. If we're thinking about voluntary industry standards, I'm sure many of you will be aware of the TCFD, which is essentially a best practice standard for climate risk disclosure that's been developed by industry. We're interested in the way it adds a little bit to legal obligations for companies in that it recommends that companies stress test their business strategy against Paris-aligned emissions reduction scenarios. It recommends that companies set targets to help them manage their climate-related risks and set up governance regimes around climate risk. An initiative with much more kind of substantive impact potentially is the Science-Based Target Setting Initiative. It's essentially an accreditation platform which supports companies to transpose the global temperature goals of the Paris Agreement to the level or the scale of an individual corporate entity. So they provide a methodology or a range of different methodologies and accredit company targets that tick off against these methodologies. And then they encourage companies to report publicly on their performance against their targets and provide their own third-party assessment of progress. In terms of investor engagement, a good example to illustrate what we're talking about is the Net Zero Company Benchmark Initiative of a coalition of large-scale institutional investors, which is called Climate Action 100+. And this initiative essentially targets a selection of high greenhouse gas emitting companies, 180 in total, and benchmarks them on their climate performance and then publicly reports on their performance against a range of climate-related indicators. Now, these indicators include whether the companies set a science-based target, but also whether they've disclosed a decarbonisation strategy to deliver on the target, whether they have good climate risk governance at a board level in place within the company, and, for example, whether the company's executive remuneration also incorporates climate performance. And then one more slide before I hand over, Michael, just to kind of illustrate what's happening in the strategic litigation space is another example of private regulatory activity. Cases targeting private sector actors on their approach to climate change are increasing around the world. And there's been a kind of recent shift from cases which are seeking to establish and begin to enforce legal obligations to disclose climate-related financial risks to more forward-looking cases which are challenging the adequacy and the substance of company approaches to climate risk management, including their net zero pledges. And a really good example is a case that's been launched very recently in Australia against one of our big oil and gas companies, Santos. This is a case being brought by the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, and it's alleging that Santos and its directors have engaged in misleading or deceptive conduct by claiming in their annual report that gas, one of their main products, is a clean fuel that's central to the clean energy transition, and claiming that they have a clear and credible pathway to achieve their net zero target by 2040, when it's alleged the plan they put forward is very scant on detail and heavily reliant on offsets and carbon capture and storage, which have a whole range of problems associated with them. So I'll hand over now to Michael, because what we're doing with this work, and we're just getting started, is trying to conduct an empirical study to try and measure and understand how some of these drivers, these private climate regulatory drivers, are impacting actual practice in companies in Australia.
Okay, thanks, Anita. And it's worth pointing out that, yeah, it has been slower than anticipated. And one of the things, of course, is that as companies come under more pressure, they can either engage in meaningful action or they can engage their PR department to turn out more guff that makes it harder to disentangle fact from fluff, let's call it. But our goal in undertaking this empirical work was to examine the ASX 100, that's the 100 largest companies by market capitalisation. And at this point, we're well short of that just because of the time it's taken to sort through the fluff. But what we're really interested in are these questions here. What climate commitments are they making? Do the commitments meet emerging best practice standards, i.e., as Anita was just saying, science-based targets? And what are some of the key private regulatory drivers? And are there some that perhaps, Anita mentioned a few that we haven't been looking at? And are there notable differences between not just individual company approaches, but sectors and the type of company we're considering? And just quickly to set the scene, the graph on the right shows there has been a steady increase in adoption of the TCFD framework, with about 35% of ASX 100 companies listed as publicly declared TCFD Australian supporters. It's actually a bit higher because as we've been going through this work, we're finding that some Australian listed companies have engaged with TCFD through offshore offices and aren't recorded in that number. So it's actually more like 37 at least, because I've found that Rio engages through their London office and QBE Insurance through France. Much slower uptake of science-based target indicators, only 14%. Listed as committed, and only 4 companies have actually set verified or endorsed targets. There's some interest in business aspiration 1.5 or companies committing to set a target in line with 1.5 degrees. So the graph provides both optimism and caution. Optimism that we're seeing growth in commitments, caution that companies are reluctant to be tied to science-based targets. So our sample looks something like this. There's a heavy representation of financials and a fairly high representation of mining companies. But we're seeing in our top 30 a higher proportion of TCFD supporters than the ASX 100 as a whole. So we could assume there's a bias towards larger companies. There's actually a lower proportion of SBTI committed companies, but 3/4 of those, the 3 out of the 4 that have verified SBTI targets are within the top 30 companies, and 6 out of the 15 climate action 100 plus companies are in this group. We are already seeing progress. In 2018, Market Forces listed 6 of these companies as either not accepting science or only fuzzy on the science. All have since made clarifying commitments to accept the science. So in that sense, there's progress. If we try to map the relationship between pressure drivers, whether it's litigation, investor action through groups like Market Forces, groups like Climate Action 100 Plus, or shareholder action through groups like Market Forces and ACCR, then we're seeing some relationship there. Sectors with no pressure have the weakest or no commitments. On the other hand, sectors with the strongest pressure, energy, also generally have weak commitments, with the exception of Origin, but certainly Santos and Woodside in this group are fairly weak. And interestingly, companies with the strongest commitments, like Woolworths and Transurban, are from really sectors with mixed or medium results. So I think we can assume that that regulatory and investor pressure plays a role, but there are also other factors that might be reputation, in other words, brand value as a positive driver, or a capacity for change as a negative driver. And in that sense, Wesfarmers is an interesting example, because there are different commitments from their customer-facing businesses like Bunnings and Officeworks, as opposed to their mining, fertilizer and industrials business. If we look at how they're responding to...
Sorry to interrupt, Michael. I'm very strict with timing, and you guys have already been over 5 minutes over your time. So please wrap up, because we still have 3 papers to go in this panel. Thanks.
Sure. Okay. So briefly, if we look at how companies are responding, there's a big embrace of TCFD with 26 out of the 30 companies. But we're seeing that the usefulness of this is quite limited, with a really mixed bag of reports. And there's a danger that process-based tools can become a bit of a tick-the-box exercise. So in terms of commitments, again, if we look at those with what I've listed as strong performance, they tend to be those who've engaged with things like SBTI tend to have produced acceptable performance reports, and that may be self-fulfilling insofar as they're engaging and therefore they're wanting to demonstrate commitment. But the other observation from this table is that the same cohort of companies tend to engage with a wider group of initiatives. So there's some further research there that
You're muted, Michael.
Sorry. Pressure does lead to commitments of varying specificity. Adopting process standards is easier than performance standards. Corporate engagement is growing, but also the drivers are being undermined. And one example of that is the recent regulations relating to proxy advisors, which is undermining the ability of to influence investment decisions. And that's it. Sorry for going over time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Anita and Michael. Our next paper is going to be presented by Nikki Van Dyke. Nikki is currently a PhD candidate from University of Tasmania. At its law faculty, she combines philosophy and law to analyze the proposals for institutions for future generation. Her paper is about, not about us, but with us, mini publics and intergenerational climate justice. So please go ahead, Nikki.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'll just start my timer so I have it too. Yeah, I'm here from the unceded lands of the Muwanina people in Lutruwita, and I feel very privileged that I can work and learn on these beautiful lands and this island for a little bit longer. And I also want to thank the organizers for bringing together such an excellent group of scholars. I'm really excited that I can communicate with the rest of the world again, which is not always very easy from a little island like Tasmania. Yeah, so my research is, well, it's about climate change, and it's specifically about future generations and young people. So as we all know, future generations and young people will suffer most of the consequences of climate change, but they often don't have a say in the policies that shape their future. So many people have come up with new institutions or changes to existing institutions and make sure that we can better make policies and laws for the long-term future. So examples are ombudspersons for future generations, or constitutional provisions about sustainability or the right to a healthy environment, or lowering the voting age even. There are lots of opportunities out there. And I want to focus on one specific proposal for an institution that could potentially help us be more intergenerationally just. And that is mini publics, or as it's more commonly known, citizens' assemblies. So citizens' assemblies are places where groups of very diverse people come together for several weekends or several days, and they talk together. So these people are a very diverse group of citizens. They are picked through lottery, and the idea is that it's a large enough group and a diverse enough group to be representative of the population, but also small enough to really have a good deliberation. So what they do when they come together is first they learn from experts about a topic, for example, climate change. Then they deliberate together with help of facilitation in bigger groups and smaller groups. And then they come to recommendations together and they give these to policymakers. And the reason that I find mini publics or citizens' assemblies so interesting is because they could be potentially really good for intergenerational justice. So first of all, citizen assemblies seem to work best when a problem is really complex and when that problem has short-term gains and long-term costs, and when it's about something about which people have really diverging opinion, such as climate change. But also many of the drivers that are currently leading politicians to think very short-term oriented are not present in this process. So for example, ordinary citizens don't have to get re-elected. They're not pressured by mass media. They're not going for lunch with lobbyists and so on. So that helps them have that long-term vision in a more uninterrupted way. And last, there are other design elements that could be built into citizens' assemblies to help people deliberate and think in a more long-term way. And so I will analyze citizen assemblies a bit more in the coming 10 minutes, but specifically I'm going to focus on the Scottish Climate Assembly. So this is an assembly that took place not that long ago, and I think it's really novel because first of all, it was online, but still there was like a good group together that grew together and had a massive impact. And second of all, it included children in the assembly for the first time, as far as I know, which I think is particularly interesting for an intergenerational justice perspective. So a bit more information about the Scottish Climate Assembly. It came into being after the amendment of the Scottish Climate Change Acts of 2009. This new act had new emission reduction targets and also had the establishment of a one-off citizens' assembly to discuss how they could achieve this new target. The bill had unanimous support from government. It was fully funded by government, this citizens' assembly, and also the government committed to respond to all the recommendations in a very elaborate way. So the first step was selecting participants. So the idea is that all the people in the Citizens' Assembly were representative of the Scottish population. So they selected people based on balance of age, gender, household income, and a couple of other characteristics, but also their attitudes toward climate change to make sure that there were some climate deniers in the room as well. And the organizers really made sure that there was adequate support for people who were not that tech savvy but would still like to join, to really make sure that it has a representative sample of citizens. And then these citizens came together online for 6 weekends, and they asked for a 7th weekend because they needed more time, and an 8th weekend to discuss the government's response, just after the government responded to their recommendations. And they chatted about climate change, and they did so in 3 different streams. So they talked about diet and lifestyle, about homes and communities, and work and travel. And each of these 3 streams, in smaller groups, they discussed the topic, they came up with recommendations, they had supporting statements, and then in the end, the whole assembly voted on all these goals and recommendations. So in the end, the outcome was 16 goals and 81 recommendations, according to many, way too much. But what was interesting was that 79 of these 81 recommendations had over 75% support of the whole assembly. So it seemed like really the whole group came together and came up with some ambitious proposals. And what is particularly interesting was that there, alongside to this assembly with adults, there was also a children's parliament. So the adult assembly was only people over the age of 16, but then for younger children, there was basically another climate assembly, but in an age-appropriate way. So 12 children learned and discussed informed recommendations alongside the assembly, and they fed this into the adult assembly via videos and via meetings, but also their recommendations were included in the final report. So now my question is, how is this really that beneficial for intergenerational justice? Or maybe more interestingly, how can we change this process of having citizens' assemblies so they could be more intergenerationally just? And to analyze this, I use a framework that I've developed with Jonathan Hoffman from Warwick University. And we came up with a framework for how you can evaluate institutions for future generations, and especially how you can improve those institutions. I'm not going through all the criteria because that's too much. So I'll just talk about the ones that I found particularly interesting and where I think there's the most space for improvement. So first of all, the effectiveness of the assembly. So I think this kind of has two parts. So on the one hand, there need to be recommendations that are intergenerationally just. And on the other hand, those recommendations need to go into the world. So influence policymakers, influence the media and the wider public. And I think their impact has been done in a couple of ways. So first of all, as I already mentioned, the chances of there being intergenerationally just recommendations are a lot higher because the assembly members are not influenced by those drivers of short-term thinking. So they're not pressured by the mass media or party politics or lobbyists. They can really think by themselves and not care that much about others. But something else that is often argued is that talking in itself will help people come to more long-term oriented solutions by themselves. So the talking in itself is kind of magic. And what people argue is that the talking helps you get an emotional state that permits you to be your better self as a democratic citizen. So generally, talking helps us to become more other regarding, but people argue it also helps us become more future regarding. Now, there's not a lot of research about all of this, but indeed, initial lab studies seem to suggest that if people talk, they are more likely to endorse, more willing to endorse things like tree planting or a tax on gas, even though these interventions will only have benefits 5 or 40 years into the future. And last, I think there are a lot of design elements that could help a citizens' assembly members make future people more emotionally present. So first of all, the question that is asked in the assembly could be more future oriented. So in this case, the Scottish Climate Assembly asked, how should Scotland tackle the climate emergency in a fair and effective way? But other climate assemblies have very explicitly made this a forward-oriented task. So for example, an assembly in the Netherlands has proposed the question, what could our agriculture look like in the future? So to specifically prime people to think about the future. Secondly, the experts from which all the participants learn could focus more on the future impacts of different mitigation and adaptation methods. So in how the information is provided, information about the future could also be more highlighted at least. And third, the way people deliberate could be changed in a way so people are more likely to think of the future consequences of what they propose. So for example, a method that is often suggested is backcasting, where you ask people to imagine about what kind of future they want. They can think about anything. Is that one with floods and bushfires or not? And once people decided what kind of future they want, you ask them to, okay, now let's reason back and think, what should we do now and what should we do in 10 years to get there? So this imagining of the future first will help people be more future oriented. Or another thing that could help is just randomly assign people with the role of a future generation for a day or an hour or a weekend or whatever, and ask from now on, for this hour, you will talk on behalf of future generations in a way that you think is most fitting. Which will also help people think more about the future. And last, I think the way children are used in this assembly is, well, first of all, it's really admirable that they tried it in the first place, but I think they could ramp it up a bit. So, for example, at the moment, children only had one meeting with the adult assembly members, and the research really shows that after this meeting, the thinking of adults really changed. Adults were more action guiding, were more direct, were more, let's do something about this. So more involvement of children, for example, through art or through videos or direct meetings could improve this. I'll skip these. And then I'll look at the moral legitimacy of an institution. So, of course, yeah, so this criteria is basically about all the other moral costs that we should consider if we want to establish a new institution or reform an already existing institution. And the reason for this is that, for example, autocratic dictators or religious coups, like even if they're super, super benevolent, most of us would say that they pose unjustifiable democratic costs and therefore we should not employ them. So I've also analyzed citizen assemblies from that point of view, and I want to specifically look at the effects of an institution on other beings that have intrinsic value but are not humans. And yeah, so it could be that the outcomes of the assembly have unjustifiable costs for non-humans, or that the process is in such a way very anthropocentric that leads to that. And I think there are mostly two improvements that I think could be very interesting. So first of all, the inclusion of children again seems to make a difference here too. So it doesn't only make people reason more future oriented, but also less anthropocentric. And what's really interesting from analyzing the recommendations of the children, it seems that children in their reasoning are already less anthropocentric. For example, they propose a ban on hunting animals, not because of the emissions that animal cause, but because of the care for the animal as a being with intrinsic value. And because children keep bringing up those things that not necessarily are really relevant for climate change straight away, but they just highlight the value of non-humans. And secondly, I think the expert and the organizers could also do something in this. So at the moment, the expert and the organizing were mostly white, from a cultural majority and from a Western philosophical tradition. So it means that they, in the way they provided the information, they uphold the binary between humans and non-human nature, and also they mostly focused on the impacts of climate change on humans. So a wider diversity in experts could have changed that. So in conclusion, I think assemblies are really interesting. I think they could have many benefits. They might not be that effective, but they could have many benefits in other ways. And I think it's really promising that if you bring a really wide, diverse group of people together, including children, that they just can agree on the best course of action for major policy changes in a really ambitious and action guiding way. And I think the space for improvements are researching more how children could be included in this decision-making process, and also using other design features that could make the outcomes of deliberation more future-oriented and less anthropocentric. Now, if you're keen to talk more about it, please get in touch via email or on Twitter. I would be very keen to chat more. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Nikki. I think this really adds to the discussion on this panel from a different perspective regarding the climate actions. So our next speaker needs no introduction, Professor Erica Teixeira, Professor of Environmental Law from University of Western Australia Law School. In particular, Erica was the director of the Center for Environmental Law here at Macquarie University over a decade ago. So it is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Erica Teixeira to this conference. And so she will talk about, can nature-based solutions to climate change catalyst coastal ecosystem conservation, a case study of the Indo-Pacific SIDs. So please, Erica.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I miss being at Macquarie University quite often. But I'm speaking to you today from Wajak Noongar land, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So this piece of research I want to give a brief overview today is to do with analysing the NDCs of different small island developing states in the Indian Ocean, and to explore whether the focus which is emerging on nature-based solutions to climate change can improve and enhance coastal and marine protection and restoration. So I'm definitely coming at this from the viewpoint of sort of marine and coastal environmental law, but looking at some of these issues. So I'll just start with a couple of images. I'm sure you're all aware of the risks to the coastal environment, the degradation of different coastal and marine ecosystems, but also the benefits they bring in terms of the ecosystem services they provide, but also the emerging solutions they might present for climate change adaptation and mitigation. So I'm focusing largely on both the adaptation side, that's one of the particular aspects I wanted to look at, and a little bit on mitigation as well. And the focus more on adaptation is largely because I think that's where the greatest political will can be found in the small island developing states, because they are vulnerable in particular to the impacts of climate change, but they're not responsible for the emissions. So I was really inspired to do this work by a report that came out last year, in the middle of last year, looking at nature-based solutions in the NDCs. And when I read that report, there were a limited, as you can see here, limited number of small island developing states which were explored. And so I wanted to provide a more comprehensive analysis, but also to bring a legal perspective, which is the piece of work that I'm doing at the moment. So I'll come to that in a minute. But you can see here quite a good analysis, and largely if you look at the last column, this is the interesting factor, that there is a growing ambition by majority of countries to recognise nature-based solutions to climate change involving coastal and marine ecosystems, and to therefore protect, manage and restore them. So if we have that political will, if we have that ambition, how can we harness that for the greater protection of the ecosystems and achieve multiple benefits at the same time? So most people will know the countries I'm looking at are the Indo-Pacific small island developing states. When we talk about SIDS, we tend to talk about three groups: Pacific, Indian Ocean, and then the Caribbean. So I have not yet explored the Caribbean, and anytime people want to let me go there, that would be great, and I can do that. But I've traveled to many of these places over a number of years in the Indo-Pacific region. So the interesting aspect, they're a very diverse group of islands. They're not all the same. Some are very high volcanic islands, some are low-lying atolls. So we don't think that they're all countries which can easily become inundated, but they are all impacted. Although they're all developing by definition, they're on different positions on that development spectrum. So we have to be a little bit careful about the capacity these countries have to implement particularly new law and policy. Some have indigenous peoples, but not all of them. So the Pacific, certainly high indigeneity, less so in the Indian Ocean, but there's such diverse sociocultural groupings. And from my point of view, I find the Indo-Pacific SIDS very interesting because they represent every legal system virtually in the whole world, from Sharia law, common law, civil law, all kinds of customary law. So it's interesting legally as well. Keeps you on your toes. So in terms of commonalities, they're all vulnerable, and they have they have a commonality in that they have contributed minimally to climate change, but will suffer some of the consequences. They've grouped together and have this voice at the UN level through AOSIS, which gives them, I think, a venue, a forum, if you like, to come together and share those commonalities. And they are also tend to be quite biodiverse in terms of marine biodiversity, less so land-based, but certainly in terms of marine biodiversity, they're diverse with large marine areas as a general rule compared to the size of their land areas. So there are reasons for them to share their experiences and including their laws. So just having a quick look at a table here on the Indo-Pacific SIDS, this was the sort of background work that I did, is to say, well, have they all filed their NDCs? That they have. The majority of them have also updated their NDCs. And so the ones highlighted in red on this slide are the ones that I looked at. There's a couple of states there you'll see have not updated them, but the majority have. And some of them actually filed new and second NDCs quite recently. And these are the four issues I really looked at. So I wanted to look firstly at marine and coastal ecosystems and how they were recognised or referred to. What was the bigger picture context that you could use as a proxy for political will to either exploit those ecosystems, restore them, or conserve them. So I wanted to look at how they were mentioned, and you can see almost all of the SIDS did mention marine and coastal ecosystems. Not all of them, but almost all of them. And you'll see there FSM and Palau did not, but they are the two states which have not yet filed a revised NDC. I wanted to look at governance because that's what I know about, but that was sort of the end point. But the other two columns there, I wanted to look at blue carbon, carbon sinks, the potential of ecosystems, marine ecosystems to provide those services and whether they were recognised in NDCs. And then the explicit reference to nature-based solutions for mitigation and for adaptation. So the X's just show where these items are mentioned, and the M&A in the last column is to do with mitigation and adaptation. And you can see there that there were 3 states which, you know, really engaged with these issues quite widely: Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and Seychelles. I don't think any of those countries, it's surprising. Certainly, Seychelles has been very active in sort of the blue economy, marine and coastal ecosystem, climate change spheres, Fiji and Papua New Guinea as well. So I just, a table here just to draw out some of the key elements that I found in the different NDCs, the different language that's used, and the focus on, for example, if you look there at Fiji, it talks about conservation, restoration and enhancement, particularly of mangroves, seagrasses, coral reefs. And then if you go down to something like Solomon Islands, they're very much talking about ecosystem-based vulnerability assessments and adaptation. So some of the countries focused very squarely on sort of the outcome, improved conservation, whereas others talked about facilitating research, enhancing knowledge, mapping and acquiring the baseline information that they don't yet have. And I found this quite interesting because it seems to me that there's a great deal of benefit then in partnering with some of these countries, particularly less so for law, but more for science, in helping build those mapping skills, the monitoring skills, the research skills. So there's quite a lot of capacity building that could easily be done. When you get down to somewhere at the bottom, like the Seychelles, which is quite advanced in this area, there's a recognition that coastal wetlands are carbon stocks. They want to protect and enhance these ecosystems, maintain and improve carbon sink capabilities. Reference to already an existing climate change policy, recognizing ecosystem services, adopting nature-based solutions. You know, this is a very sophisticated reference to the carbon sinks, the mitigation, the adaptation, nature-based solutions, compared to some of the other countries which are, their statements are much more generic. And you can see the same if you actually sort of search for, and here I was actually searching for the words either blue carbon or carbon sink. And I've highlighted, you know, there's some of the key issues. Again, the mapping is referred to, assessment and monitoring is referred to. But you see here, Palau, quite early on, considering this is its 2016 NDC, referring to institutional and policy frameworks for mitigation via carbon sinks. So it isn't necessarily the case that the newest NDCs are more detailed or drill down into some of these areas. It really is very much a reflection of each individual country and what is important to that country. The same with nature-based solutions. You can see hardly any of these countries actually referred to nature-based solutions explicitly, and these were found in the more contemporary NDCs, either the updated ones or the second round. Again, looking here at different aspects. So Fiji, coastal protection, Papua New Guinea, they've focused there on helping to finance domestic nature-based solutions. That's one of their critical issues. Marine protected areas, Tonga refers to that. So there's a real diversity here of different approaches and different ways in which blue carbon and nature-based and then nature-based solutions here are referred to. It's not very easy, and I have certainly not found an identifiable pattern. So where I am at the moment in terms of the governance is I drew out the different references to governance, and by governance here I mean sort of policy and capturing policy, law, planning, institutional support, etc. So this is the analysis through the NDCs themselves. You've got Fiji referring to a climate change bill there, and climate change policies in different nations, some of which go, you can see they're through to 2030, 2031, so they're quite long-term plans. So since several of these NDCs were actually drafted, there's been further development in this area, which wasn't sort of captured ahead of time in the NDCs. So we know Maldives has introduced a climate emergency bill. Mauritius has got a climate bill, I think that's still before Parliament. Seychelles did refer to its climate change policy elsewhere. PNG has got a Climate Change Management Act, I think is 2015 or 2016, it's quite old. Almost all of these countries are now moving to develop some targeted law. And this is the stage I'm up to at the moment. So I've done this sort of background work and analysis, simple analysis of the NDCs, and now I'm looking at those different laws and the institutions they've created, in some cases, even including ministries for climate change and the environment, which expand upon existing institutions, analysing those, exploring whether what the alignment is between those new laws and the commitments made in these NDCs, whether the political will or the governments have moved beyond the commitments they made in these NDCs, or whether they really are making sure that they are adhering to these in a sort of legal sense. And then the last aspect for me, which is the most complicated one, which I have not finished yet, is to analyse the alignment and the integration of these new climate change laws and institutions with existing institutions for marine and coastal environmental protection and marine protected areas, integrated coastal zone management laws, planning laws. Because I think there is a risk of an overlay, if you like, of new law that's climate law that you know, it's seen as very contemporary, seen as something where there is political will and there's public support, but it in a small island developing state it could be quite burdensome, I think, to layer that on top of existing law, and there is a risk that either we get this sort of congestion of institutions and laws, or it just leads to inertia. So that's my sort of where I'm going to next. So in terms of the analysis, I found that the diversity of SIDS themselves, geographic diversity, cultural diversity, economic diversity, is matched by their NDCs. No two NDCs, no two states have the same mix of initiatives. The categories of action are similar, but they're not identical. The positions on the spectrum of development are also matched by the NDCs. The more developed countries already have baseline data. They clearly have technical capacity. They also have some legislation in place, but others do not. But there is quite clear areas where capacity, I think, can be built, and particularly for a country like Australia that assists other states across the whole Indo-Pacific. My findings were consistent with that 2021 report in that references to coastal ecosystems, nature-based solutions, and ambition are all increasing. And then I genuinely believe that sharing knowledge and experiences is likely to yield significant benefits for these countries, particularly in the area of governance, where often ministries have just one environmental legal officer, and there's going to need to be a lot of legal capacity to assist these countries to achieve their ambitions. And then, of course, we need all of that scientific side as well, and the monitoring and the data to continuously improve going forward, because we certainly don't want to be in a situation where these laws become new climate acts on paper and don't actually achieve anything for the marine ecosystems. So you can see some of the gaps here, going back to my original slide. These are all gaps where there isn't really much at all in the NDCs of the different countries. So there's clearly room to add additional information there. So, you know, I've summarised here on this slide just some of the things that could be included as sort of headers within the different areas. So reducing damaging activities, protecting, restoring, conserving, reference to carbon sinks, whether it's framed as blue carbon or not, nature-based solutions, law and policy, education, which I haven't really covered here, but is a key focus as well, and then financing. So this is what they might consider including in any future more updated NDC if they want, where there are still gaps, and particularly for those countries which I had on the last slide, which don't yet have these commitments. So that's where I'm at to at the moment. It's a work in progress. So I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. I think this is such a comprehensive kind of case study on the implementation of nature-based solutions in such a vast, diverse area of the Indo-Pacific small island countries. And I really would like to come back to this at some point in the Q&A, because I mean, this nature-based solution is a new concept, relatively new concept. What's the difference from all those previous concepts, such as ecosystem-based management, ecosystem approach, ecosystem service, and all these sorts of things? So we will hear our final presentation and the next presentation also to talk about nature-based solutions, but with focus on the Arctic and Antarctica. And our final presenter, Associate Professor Hitomi Kimura, is from Japan. So she's an associate professor at Otsuma Women's University in Tokyo. So Hitomi's topic, as you can read, is the nature-based solutions as key to strengthen climate and biodiversity nexus under the Anthropocene in the polar regions. It's a question mark. So please, Hitomi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I would like to thank the organizer that I could attend from Tokyo. How could the nature-based solution contribute to the necessary paradigm shift of the international environmental law, which we face under the Anthropocene, and reconsider the human-nature relationship? My presentation will especially focus on the polar region, where the impact of climate change and diversity loss, and hence the climate diversity nexus, is critical. What is the rights and responsibility of humans to nature as the trusteeship of the earth? 20 years ago, IUCN introduced the idea of a nature-based solution based on the ecosystem approach, which is developed under the Convention on Biodiversity, CBD. Nature-based solution is defined as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural and modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing the human well-being and biodiversity benefits. Some studies show that nature-based solutions can cool the planet if we act now by reducing the peak of 2 degrees, and it's now 1.5 degree is important, trajectory by 0.3 degree. And this is one of the reasons why the nature-based solution, or more widely the nature and ecosystem, was highlighted at the COP26 of the UNFCCC in Glasgow last year. The original COP26 draft decision mentions that the critical importance of nature-based solution, ecosystem-based approaches, including protecting and restoring forests to reduce emissions, enhancing removals, and protecting biodiversity. But finally replaced the Glasgow Climate Pact as emphasizing the importance of protecting, conserving, and restoring the nature and ecosystem to achieve the Paris Agreement temperature goal, including through forests and other terrestrial and marine ecosystems acting as sinks or reservoirs of greenhouse gases, and by protecting biodiversity while ensuring social and environmental safeguards as mitigation. Why was the nature-based solution was not mentioned? Because some parties oppose, and there are some indigenous people worried about nature-based solution being used as carbon offset rather than emission reduction. Nature-based solution or ecosystem-based adaptation will be continuously discussed in the context of a 2-year Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation at COP27 next year in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, where the several initiatives were already adopted under the CBD to contribute to the formulation and implementation of the post-2020 global diversity framework. Nature-based solution is the key to strengthen climate diversity nexus or linkage under UNFCCC as well as CBD, as the IPBES report mentions. However, the CBD removed the word from the early draft of the convention, reflecting a position from developing countries. Kunming Declaration as part one of the CBD COP15 last year also failed to clearly mention the nature-based solutions. The nexus between these two conventions was not clearly recognized initially, but the 2005 Millennium Ecosystem Assessment indicated growing threat of ecosystem from climate change. The 2007 IPCC Force Assessment Report focused on global warming impact of biodiversity, ecosystems on life of human beings, and warned extinction of species such as polar bears due to melting of the ice and warming seawater temperature. This simple but shocking example contributed to gaining international wider attention to climate biodiversity nexus. Very recently, the IPBES points out the intertwining of biodiversity and climate change and impact on people's quality of life. IUCN also warns that climate and biodiversity emergencies are not distinct, but two aspects of the crisis, and established the climate change special group. So how and who implement and operationalize the nature-based solution in the Antarctica? Antarctic, especially protected area under the Environment Protocol under the Antarctic Treaty System could be solid basis to promote nature-based solution in the Antarctica. CUMLA's designation of the world's largest raw sea to the marine protected area, MPA, banning fishing, is a good model for nature-based solution. In a sense, that climate change may affect the rich diversity such as krill. However, the Antarctic specifically protected area is not designed to aim for promoting nature-based solutions. It is necessary to reach a consensus or ideally adapt resolution at the Antarctic Consultative Meeting, ATCM, to promote nature-based solution under the Antarctic specially protected areas. In terms of human-nature relationship, Antarctica, with the limited number of scientists and tourists, but without indigenous people, is relatively unaffected by human activity. This is the reason why nature-based tend to focus less on Antarctica. Therefore, it might be a good idea to start from the International Science Research Cooperation among the willing claimant, non-claimant, and non-recognized, and stay jointly to develop new pilot project, for example, around bases involving the human scientist activities along the Ross Sea, or incorporate the nature-based solution aspect to the existing areas with as much human presence. It will also contribute to achieve the 30% protection target of habitat area expected under the CBD COP15 Part 2 to be held in Kunming in May this year. This approach is aligned to the future figure of environmental law, from what we can get out of nature to what we can and must do for it, as described in the purpose of this colloquium. More proactive action contribution by human beings to restore nature in nature-based solution is additional aspect to the ecosystem approach for conservation of nature. With the increasing interest of to polar region to play in global climate and ecosystem, it is necessary to internationalize the Antarctic Treaty System without drastic threat and the total change of the regime, but strengthen the aspect of common heritage of mankind as outer space or deep seabed or atmosphere recently, which will be more important in the era of Anthropocene, but still controversial in a legal sense. Proposal by Australia and France at CAMRA to seek international support to establish an Antarctic wilderness or world park is also worthwhile to reconsider under the Anthropocene, when tourist activities will recover after the pandemic, and the human environmental impact should not jeopardize climate and diversity in the region. But with the same reason, rather than spending time to discuss whether to hand over the control of the area from the treaty to the United Nations and recognize the Antarctic as global commons or common heritage of mankind, it might be more realistic to think about how to modify the treaty system to accommodate to the era of Anthropocene. The issue is who owns the Antarctica and who is responsible for the Antarctica. More fundamentally, considering the increasing impact of climate change in the Antarctica and the necessity to strengthen climate diverse nexus under the Antarctic Treaty System, it is also worthwhile to consider adding new annex to climate change under the environment protocol, in addition to the 4 annex on the environmental impact assessment, fauna, flora, waste disposal, marine pollution. In particular, protection of fauna and flora through more effective implementation of environmental impact assessment should be strengthened in relation to climate diversity nexus. As Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting has also adopted specific measures to manage human disturbance of Antarctic fauna and flora, including a recommendation on guidance for visitors to the Antarctica in the past. Although the subsidiary group of climate change response was established in 2017, it is necessary for the Committee for Environment Protection to strengthen nexus new issues such as climate change, bioprospecting, which is influenced the future of Antarctica very much, and the recent virus from outside, since these issues were not the original main mandate of the committee to protect the Antarctic environment. Antarctica has been the frontier of international environmental law. Antarctic Treaty has been very unique nature, such as peaceful use, demilitarization, and prohibition of nuclear tests. Depletion of the ozone hole in the Antarctica led to the adoption of Vienna Convention and Montreal Protocol. Now it is time to enter a new global challenge that we face under the Anthropocene. So this is my final slide. The human-nature relationship plays a more crucial role in the Arctic region compared to the Antarctic without permanent residents except scientists. Climate change influences environment, animals, and humans, in particular the indigenous people depend on the Arctic ecosystem and natural resources. Therefore, the adaptation using the traditional knowledge is crucial to promote nature-based solution in this region. COP26 decision also mentioned the importance of adaptation action should be based on the traditional knowledge of indigenous people. In the Arctic region, since climate change is the biggest driver of diversity loss, climate diversity nexus should be emphasized. It is important to recognize this climate system, biodiversity system, human system as a whole, rather than to threats of treat as a dichotomy between the human versus nature. We human beings are only part of the united ecosystem. Restoration or damaged tundra wetland due to forest or forest fire, melting permafrost in Alaska, Siberia as sinks or carbon, in particular methane emission is the key nature-based solution. In Glasgow, more than 100 countries adopted the global methane pledge to reduce 30%. In this sense, nature-based solution in agriculture sit in a huge potential to reduce methane emissions and provide environmentally sustainable food production. Coastal wetlands and coral reef not only increase the carbon in the ocean, but also provide co-benefits to protect human beings from disasters such as sea level rise, high waves, and floods. Restoration of coastal ecosystems increase blue carbon is another activity to promote nature-based solution. It is also important to think about the nexus between the land-ocean ecosystem in a holistic manner, although which currently tend to be dealt in a different legal regime. In the process, decarbonizing zero carbon fossil fuel dependent Arctic region, the use of bioenergy should be carefully considered since it may be good for climate, but not for diversity. Therefore, effective management forests is crucial. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hitomi. Perfect timing. And now I think we have got about 35 minutes for the Q&A session for all the speakers. And I can see that we have already, people are already have already written their questions. 2 questions for Jen, and Jen has kindly answered them in the Q&A function. So so there is one open question now from, once again, from Dr. Shriti in Indonesian. I think you are from the University Islam Indonesia. I think that question is for Anita and Michael. So Anita and Michael, are you still with us? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Shriti asked, what kinds of regulations that may encourage the awareness of the corporation to participate in reducing emission and combating climate change? I think that's quite
Yeah, thanks, Sri, for the question. I didn't want to have a go at trying to type an answer because it's a very big question. I mean, I guess I'd start off by emphasising that we desperately need governments to put in place strong, substantive climate laws, and there's lots of ways that governments can regulate the private sector and achieve emissions reductions, you know, carbon tax, emissions trading, emission standards on high emitting activities, the kind of incentives that Jan was talking about for investing in carbon removal technologies, but ultimately as well, just putting in place appropriate emissions reduction targets and perhaps having a framework climate law in place to also set in place strategies for different sectors of the economy that map out a pathway to achieve those emissions reduction targets. So, you know, clear role for governments. I guess what our research though is trying to do is look at what's happening in the private space where we've got a bit of a weakness in Australian climate law in terms of substantive climate law. And I think, you know, over the last few years, we've seen the reporting obligations, the risk management obligations that come from corporate law play quite a role in putting climate change on the agenda for the private sector and in, you know, building awareness, as you say. And what we were trying to argue and look at, I guess, and explore through our paper is whether those obligations plus all this private climate regulatory activity, which is being undertaken by investors, by civil society, by industry bodies, kind of, you know, is a value add, I guess, on top of the corporate law, and you know, is really helping to drive commitments by the private sector without having legal obligations in place to do so. And there's a lot of literature, private environmental governance literature around when, you know, in what kind of situations this kind of thing works. You know, obviously works where there's a overlap between public and private interests. There's a commercial, a business case for reducing emissions, for investing in, you know, uptake of renewable energy, etc. But there's also kind of a lot around the design of the regulatory initiatives, whether they're big on transparency to try and hold private actors to account. And you're seeing that really come through in some of the initiatives we were talking about, this real push to publicly benchmark companies against, you know, best practice climate performance indicators, and then litigation that's accompanying that to try and hold companies accountable for what they're saying they're going to do. Anyway, that's my quick take. I don't know whether Michael would like to add.
Well, I think it's going to vary with different types of companies, both large and small. So large companies, you've got an avenue through investors that have been particularly influential, driven by superannuation and pension funds that have a longer term perspective than short-term opportunistic investors. So empowering them to exercise their influence for longer term outcomes means you start to address intergenerational and long-term problems. On the other hand, the issue for smaller companies is simply having access to the capability to do this. And, you know, so on the one hand, I'm doing this work with, you know, the major listed Australian companies. On the other hand, I'm helping my daughter, who's got a factory of 4 people, try and produce carbon neutral shoes in an environment where most of her suppliers really don't want to know about any requests for carbon neutral inputs, because when you're a small scale operator, you don't have much power in your supply chain. So there, I think government regulation can assist in helping to build a critical mass of small producers, but also helping to build pressure along supply chains. Whereas I think, you know, just very quickly, the work we've done so far shows the important role using the long-term perspective of pension and superannuation funds in particular is a problem. And of course, Stern noted this in his report back in the mid-2000s, where he couldn't use economics to address climate change because it was ultimately a question of values. How much weight do you place on the interests of future generations? And we need to overcome that problem.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Anyone wants to, from the panel, also wants to address that? Or we can, because I see that Nikki actually has a question for Jen. And given that we are all here, so you can just ask live if you want.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I didn't know how to put it in the Q&A. Maybe we can't do it as panelists. Yeah, I have a question for Jen. So I noticed with technologies that have something to do with carbon, people quite often get a bit scary, for example, with the geoengineering. And I think many people here in this space are on the side of the non-use agreement that the Earth System scholars have proposed. And I understand that those net zero emission technologies are different, but you talked about a difference between natural ways of like planting trees and more tech heavy ways. And I was wondering how like the public support is for different kinds of natural versus tech heavy ways of net zero carbon emission technologies.
Thanks, Nikki. And the whole issue around the sort of solar radiation management, the non-use agreement, I'll actually be talking about tomorrow, if I can give a plug for that talk in the context of marine cloud brightening. But to go to your specific question, I think one of the things I'd want to draw a distinction on is the language of natural connotes that it's better. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that we drew a distinction between biological storage, capture and storage, rather than engineered, because there are some that would argue that clear felling a native forest in order to plant trees that will suck carbon out of the air might be natural, but it's definitely not more environmentally benign than putting in in a degraded field, putting in a whole load of direct air capture machines that will then extract the carbon and turn it into something useful that can actually be, you know, a carbon product, for example, incorporating it into a cement type product. So I just avoid that language of natural storage, capture and storage, and prefer the biological, because both have different, you know, every technology has a different mix of impacts and benefits. And at the moment, I think that there is still this discourse in both the solar radiation management and the CDR discussions around whether or not they will operate as a disincentive to strong mitigation commitments. Part of my response to that is definitely, you know, have they so far? Is that the thing that has prevented strong mitigation ambitions so far? I don't think so. So I guess I have a more pragmatic view of where we're headed and the need for, you know, whether you see it as avoiding overshoot or peak shaving or however you want to use it. I think that there is going to be a role for some of these technologies. And so there's an important piece of work to be done about building public understanding and bringing the public along with us in the development and use of these technologies. And law will be really critical in doing that, in making sure that we don't see the distribution of winners and losers in the deployment of carbon dioxide removal technologies, simply reproducing the climate justice inequities or injustices that we have in the use of fossil fuels and who bears the impacts of climate change. So there's, at a domestic scale and internationally, I think there's a really critical job to be done in policy and then the translation into law of making sure that we deal with the equity and the justice implications and the distributive justice implications, but also to make sure that we understand, you know, where we're going to be without those technologies. And if we think we're going to be in a worse place, and the modelling suggests that we are, then there's a separate task, not necessarily for the lawyers, in building public trust. And I think that's where some of the processes and some of the things that you talked about, whether it's consensus conferencing or other forms of citizen engagement, engagement with young people, building their understanding, but not just in a patronizing, we'll tell you about it and then you'll agree with it, but in a genuine sort of bottom-up engagement way. It's essential that we do that alongside the things that can be offered as a form of reassurance. I don't know whether that answered your question.
I see there is a question now posted by an anonymous attendee, but also the first question that was posted by Hamish to Jen. I think these two questions are dealing with the same kind of issue, that is the scientific knowledge and the climate regulation. So I'm wondering, so even though Jen, you have answered Hamish's question, I'm kind of opening the floor to every single presenter here, because I mean, you guys have touched upon climate regulation or climate action on different aspects, so like from technology or from private cooperation or from the youth assembly or the nexus between biodiversity and climate. So I'm wondering about, so, and also the anonymous question is to everyone in the panel is, who should be responsible for accurately interpreting and translating basic scientific data, such as ecological data, to climate policy making and lawmaking in the international context? And also, this is related to Hamish's question that scientists are not necessarily environmental friendly or fully aware of the consequences of their activities, and private sectors can use scientific research as a Trojan horse, maybe that's a bit. If you quarantine research, how would you guard against such issues? So, I mean, this is pretty much a question to everyone. So if you would like to just share your thoughts, yeah, the floor is open. We got time. Who would like to go first? And Michael, I saw Michael raised hand.
Well, I suppose the first point to make is that the assumption of the question is there is an absolute scientific truth in everything. And as we all know from epistemology, there's no such thing, that ultimately all this is in the context of our social views and values. So we can't assume that there is an absolute truth. Therefore, everything must go through a process of governance that allows the weighting of that truth in order to come to a consensus. The problem we have in so many of these governance regimes through which climate change decisions are made is that they're inevitably overrepresented by economic interests, which have a short-term time frame because of the discounting that everyone is taught in business schools, which means any impact after 10 years is virtually discounted out of consideration. So I think we need to have a process, and it was interesting that some of that I think was Nikki's presentation talked about this issue of how do we include the interests of future generations who are most seriously impacted by climate change in that decision making, in a way that balances our interpretation of science, rather than the mistaken assumption we often make is that there is an absolute scientific truth. You know, there are things that are more or less true, but ultimately interpreted in a social context, and we need mechanisms to do that, and do it in a way that allows for more than just short-term considerations, but also long-term considerations when we're dealing with long-term perverse problems like climate change.
Thanks. Erica?
I'm not going to answer in relation to climate change, but you know, a body like GASAM, for those people that might not be familiar with it, it's a UN body made up of 20 scientists. They inform 10 or 20 treaties and different bodies. So they're the group of experts on the scientific aspects of marine environmental protection. So they engage with hundreds of scientists, they explore existing data and papers that are produced, and then they write reports that inform the International Maritime Organization, the International Seabed Authority, UNDP, UNEP. So that's a practical way in which I think the UN has tried to do it, at least in relation to marine environmental protection. I don't hold myself out to be a climate law and policy specialist, but I think that's a practical way in which you have an organisation that is representative of different countries and different viewpoints, synthesising existing data and informing treaty bodies and institutions and laws.
Thanks. Hitomi?
Yeah, the role of IPCC is crucial because recently the IPCC data also includes the ecological related data. Of course, the countries will make the decision at the end of the conference, but as far as I know, the joint work between the IPCC and IPBES is very crucial because to adjust the different interpretation of interpretation could be adjusted in the process of the work. Thank you very much.
So Jen, do you have any final thoughts on that? Not final thoughts, but I see you answered that question. But if you have any further thoughts?
No, I think Anita was going to add something though.
Yeah. Anita?
Thanks. Yeah, I will add something quickly, but then I want to ask a question if I can. The question kind of made me think about one of the initiatives we talked about, this science-based target setting initiative, which is all about, we have the Paris Agreement setting these global temperature goals that allows us to work out a global carbon budget. What do you do at a company level to set a target and then be able to say that's aligned to the Paris Agreement goals? It's really complex and tricky and fraught with ethical issues when we're talking about it at the nation state level, perhaps even more so at the corporate entity level. And I think this is an interesting initiative, which we're going to explore in a bit more detail about, what are the inputs to this initiative. It's civil society and industry groups, and be interesting to see what their expertise is behind the methodologies they're setting up, which provide a pathway for companies to, set a target which they can claim is scientifically based, aligned to Paris. And a big thing there, I think, is the transparency around the methods that are proposed, and accrediting companies against the methodology. Anyway, that's just an interesting kind of example which intersects a bit with your question. Can I ask a question? If I had a question for Erica. I think at the end you were talking about the danger that kind of superimposing climate change laws on top of existing environmental laws, marine conservation laws, has a whole range of risks, inertia, complications, layering, etc. I wonder whether you think a well-designed and well-implemented framework climate law can be a way around that, because I think the kind of intention is really to frame and coordinate between lots of different sectoral responses. So when you're thinking about what a framework climate law might do in an adaptation context, in terms of setting targets and preparing sectoral adaptation plans, the idea is really to be able to coordinate and integrate across existing regimes. And I know some of the nations you've mentioned have introduced quite recent kind of framework climate laws, which have a lot of potential on paper. So I just wanted to ask for a bit more comment on the role you think they might play.
Thanks, Anita. That's kind of like, where I would hope to be by the middle of the year and be able to answer that question. In fact, my preliminary view is that you talked there about plans and targets, and I'm not sure they should be in law at all. So I'm not convinced. You may be right. We may need climate big framework laws, but I'm at this point not convinced by that. I think a very well drafted policy with an action plan might actually serve that purpose with targets, etc., which can then align and integrate the laws, because I'm not actually convinced in many cases new law is needed. The one exception I would say is natural hazards, emergency kind of provisions. They may be needed. But in terms of sort of planning and, shaping the sort of coastal zone, I think in many cases the law is there. And I guess the point I'm coming to is that I'm not convinced that putting that under, if the law isn't there, if there's no integrated coastal zone management law, and if there's no sort of ecosystem-based approaches in marine environmental law to date, I'm not sure I would like to see them in a climate change framework, because it in my mind, that's narrowing the issues. The issues still come down to, at the end of the day, people and their livelihoods and the land where they're going to live, and et cetera, and tourism enterprises and fishing. You know, so I still think you need those laws, and that's my preliminary view. Is that I'm not convinced. You might be right that a overarching framework act would be good, but I'm not convinced yet that it's essential as opposed to a really solid policy or strategy and action plan.
Yes, and I don't see any question at the moment from the attendee. So if I may, I would like to take a liberty to ask a question from our end to Erica, but also to Hitomi, as I briefly mentioned about these nature-based solutions. I mean, I'm a little bit suspicious of this concept because because my instinct kind of a kind of understanding of this concept is like it's very much human-centered, because it's nature-based solution for who must be for humans. So I must admit I don't really have a deep understanding of this concept. So I would like to ask Erica and also Hitomi to educate me further. Like, what's new? What's new in this concept? Like, no, suddenly, and this concept, I know Hitomi, you mentioned that this concept was mentioned by IUCN 20 years ago, but in my memory, it seems to be suddenly gaining a bit of popularity in recent kind of policy recommendations. Like for example, the Arctic Council is now trying to push some pilot project on that, because they used to focus on ecosystem approach or ecosystem-based management. Now they're trying to push that nature-based solutions. So I'm a little bit kind of suspicious, and also I'm a little bit kind of in the dark, that if you could educate me, like what's this and what's new? Is it better? And for what? Thanks.
No one is going to be more cynical than me about it. No, I agree with you. Look, I mean, I think that nature-based solutions, it is focusing on protection, conservation management, restoration for communities, for people, and for the ecosystem, for the two. Whereas I would say ecosystem-based approaches are really focused on the ecosystem, and we might have some services that we rely on as sort of the rationale for doing that. So no, I don't particularly like nature-based solutions, because it is more about people. I'd rather just focus on the environment, but I think I'm in a minority, and clearly ecosystem-based approaches haven't worked. All our ecosystems are in decline, so that by itself is not enough. But I suppose the reason I focused on this was because there is political will, there is a momentum and impetus for nature-based solutions, and if the alternative to that is, you know, grey infrastructure, or, you know, engineered solutions that are not nature-based, then there's no tangential benefit for ecosystems in doing that. So I am simply jumping on the bandwagon in order to try, and I said to you, I'm coming to this very much from an ecosystem-based approach. I'm less concerned, I'm not a climate lawyer, so I'm concerned about how we can better protect marine and coastal ecosystems, and if we can hang it under this hat, or put this hat, I think I've mixed my metaphors, we can, that's got to be good. That's where I'm coming from.
Thanks. Hitomi, you want to add something?
I understand your suspicion. I also agree with you. And I try to find a difference between the nature-based solutions and ecosystem. probably in the process of trying to find the better way to restore the nature rather than conserve the nature. And also we need more proactive involvement of the humans, not the intervention to restore the nature, rather than, I mean, let the nature as it is. And then we need more visible benefits for the human beings, like emission reduction through the this approach should be, if it's visible, we see more benefits. So we still need to endeavor how to proceed this approach. It was interesting to look at the thorough analysis of Erica in the CIS countries by looking at the NDCs, how the nature-based solution is interpreted differently or applied in different manner. So I would like to try in my own research in the polar region as well. But the thing is, the general concept of a nature-based solution should be more clear. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to mention, I've spent a fair bit of time working in water, and one of my favorite expressions I picked up when working in water was that most water problems start with someone's water solution, and which really goes to the issue of perverse outcomes, and that traditionally when we've tried to solve problems, we simply create more that we didn't envisage. And to me, the concept of nature-based solutions, yeah, it is a rebranding of concepts that have been around previously, but to me, it's trying to send a message that we need to look at solutions that emerge naturally rather than engineering imposed or chemical imposed or whatever, and look at something that's more harmonious. And perhaps, you know, one of the reasons governments are more interested is perhaps there's an opportunity for lower cost solutions as well and longer term solutions. So it's just
great.
My humble view.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful, because especially from a practical kind of a point of view. Any further thoughts from the panelists? All right. And I don't see any further questions from the attendees, so I think we can close our panel from here, unless anyone has any burning question at this point. Yeah, I think we do have a wonderful climate panel with 3 papers focusing on different aspects of climate regulations, and then 2 kind of case studies with focus on the nature-based solutions. And I think that's really great to see all these kind of papers coming together. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. And I look forward to catching up in different occasions and probably another SAIL event in the future. Thank you.